Today, most people in our society live in cities. Nature and the countryside seem very far away. But even in cities, have you ever noticed how much our lives are involved with those of animals? And have you noticed the very different attitudes about animals we seem to hold, often at the same time?
They're just like a lot of wild animals.
They're disgusting, mucky little pigs.
In fact, animals are involved in our lives in so many different ways that we tend to take it all for granted. But the involvement is usually on our terms, to satisfy our needs. We seldom stop to ask a very basic question. Do we have the right to make use of animals in the many ways we do?
I used to glide the endless airways. Now I'm nailed to a classroom wall. I used to roam the empty prairie. Now I'm a trophy in a dusty hall. Why did you hurt me? Why did it have to be?
Human beings use non-human animals for food and clothing, for entertainment or companionship, for medical and other scientific experiments, even as objects to kill for sport. This programme will look in detail at some of these uses and at the growing controversy over whether our attitudes and practices towards animals ought to change. Many people argue that there's nothing wrong with killing animals painlessly for food, or even inflicting suffering on animals in scientific experiments. Because humans and non-human animals are different kinds of beings. Our ability to reason, to use language, to have morals and ethics, makes us superior to the lower animals, and free to use them for our own purposes. Our interests must be regarded as more important than theirs.
But other people argue that all sentient creatures have the right to life and to freedom from suffering. If anything, our superior characteristics, language, morality and so on, should mean that human beings have a special responsibility to prevent other animals from suffering and to make sure their interests are given equal weight with our own. To give preference to human needs simply because we belong to one species and other animals belong to other species is the same kind of behaviour as that of the racist, who gives preference to his own racial group on the basis of colour alone. Would you disagree with this comparison?
We hope this programme will help you make up your own mind about the relationship between human rights and interests and those of other animals. In the rest of Part 1, we will look at the oldest and most basic uses of animals, for food and clothing, and at the way human civilization has affected the lives of animals still in the wild.
Down to the factory. Down at the factory.
Man's use of animal flesh and animal products for food goes far back in history. Although for much of the past, meat was only eaten on special or ceremonial occasions, except by the very rich. Today, in Western countries, agriculture is a huge mechanized business on a staggering scale. In Britain alone, 3,000 animals are killed every minute of the working day to provide food for humans and their pets. Food industry advertising suggests that farm animals enjoy a pleasant life before being killed. But for the sake of greater efficiency and profit, most poultry and pigs and some cattle in the developed world are now raised on factory farms in conditions of physical and mental discomfort.
Almost 70% of the piglets reared for bacon and pork in Britain are taken from their mothers when only 2 to 3 weeks old and fattened for slaughter in units that are often dark, dirty and overcrowded. Often the pigs never see daylight. For several weeks they are kept on slatted floors which allow droppings to fall through for easier cleaning, but which often cause permanent leg damage. The pigs can become so frustrated that they bite each other's tails. So farmers now cut them off as standard practice. Breeding sows are repeatedly made pregnant almost as soon as they've given birth, and then confined all alone in cramped conditions for the 16 to 17 weeks until they produce the new litter.
Now, at the factory, somebody's making paupers out of me. They cut off my tail, tie me down, my feet never see a bit of solid ground. Now, at the factory, a slice of bacon is all they see. They keep putting food in me. Down at the factory.
About 95% of all chickens and 70% of turkeys in Britain are crammed into windowless buildings to make them grow faster on less feed. Laying hens are confined in cages, sometimes as many as 8 or 9 birds to a cage. Hens with a 30-inch wingspan spend their lives in a cage width of about 4 inches each. None of the natural instincts of birds to stretch, peck, scratch, or even move can be satisfied, so the birds often peck at each other. To prevent this, some farmers routinely slice off the ends of their chickens' beaks with a hot knife, a practice which causes the birds intense pain.
At the factory, chickens as far as the eye can see. They cut off my beak to stop me pecking my friends. If they had any sense, I'd be pecking them. Down at the factory, chicken pie is all they see. They keep stuffing food in me. Down at the factory.
Most calves are separated from their mothers soon after birth, causing emotional stress to both calf and cow. Some calves are then reared for veal and may be immobilized in narrow crates, where a liquid, iron-deficient diet ensures that their flesh stays suitably white.
Down at the factory, somebody's making veal out of me. They take me from a mum, day I'm born, locked in the dark from dusk till dawn. Down at the factory, a veal cutlet is all they see, and they keep stuffing food in me. Down at the factory.
The public is told that the moment of death is usually painless for factory farm animals, but in fact, many are slaughtered while still fully conscious, causing suffering and terror to each animal killed.
Down at the factory. Down at the factory. Please don't take me down to the factory. Don't wanna go down to the factory.
Our Western diet, with its heavy meat consumption, does not only raise questions about the suffering of animals. Serious issues of human suffering are also at stake. In order to produce high-quality meat, animals in Western countries are fed huge quantities of high-protein crops that could be feeding humans. Of course, we get protein from eating the animals, but it's a very inefficient system. On average, we have to feed animals about 10 pounds of plant protein to get 1 pound of meat protein back. Here's another way to put it. Enough food to wipe out starvation in developing countries around the world could be made available if America's livestock population were reduced by just 1/8. How do you feel about the use of animals for food and the treatment of animals in a factory farming system?
The case for factory farming is argued by Doug Thau of the National Farmers Union.
The reason why animals are kept more indoors than outdoors these days, I think, is essentially because their food and water can be carefully controlled, and as well as the heat and light. And all of these things are very important in terms of trying to get the best out of a particular bird or animal. Birds and animals would soon know if a system under which they were being kept was causing them harm. Equally so would farmers. And obviously, if a bird or animal is distressed, then the farmer will very quickly change the system under which he's producing these animals or birds. I don't think that we can turn the clock back to keeping all birds and animals outdoors, for the simple reason that we wouldn't be producing sufficient foodstuffs to feed the population which we have in this country today. Additionally, it has to be remembered that, roughly speaking, 1/3 of the world's population are either starving or undernourished. So therefore, farmers are under a moral obligation to keep birds and animals in intensive conditions where they can produce foodstuffs in the most economic, optimum fashion.
Peter Roberts of the organisation Compassion in World Farming sums up the opposition case.
Factory farm animals are deprived of everything that makes life worth living. They're very often weaned at an unnaturally early age. They're deprived of the companionship of their own kind. They're deprived of the ability to relate to the land. Sometimes they're penned so closely that they can't turn round, and they can't even groom themselves and keep clean. But I believe that the species of animals which we're using for food are very close to us in their physiology and in their requirements of what makes life worth living. Obviously, we've got to have short-term aims and long-term aims, and I think in the short term we must get minimum welfare standards for each class of livestock for the protection of these animals from the factory farming community. And in the long term, we've got to reduce our dependence on animals altogether.
People who feel that it's wrong for human beings to kill and eat other animals, regardless of how cruelly or humanely the animals might be treated, see a vegetarian diet as the most satisfactory alternative. Vegetarians argue that we do not need to eat animals to survive, and that the right of animals to life should override the pleasure we might get from Sunday roast dinner. What do you think?
Human beings have traditionally used animals as a source of clothing. But this costs some animals less than it costs others.
Madam got a brand new coat today, and it looks so real. Can I feel your baby seal, because it looks so real?
Some 30 million fur-bearing animals suffer agonizing death in steel-toothed traps each year, while other animals, such as foxes and mink, are now bred in factory farm conditions. In the case of leather, clothing and other articles are made from the skins of animals that we kill in any case for food. Given the alternatives, materials made from plants and modern synthetics such as acrylic and nylon, how do you feel about the ways in which animals are used for clothing?
Human progress is often measured by the extent to which people are able to subdue the environment around them and bend it to their own purposes. Historically, it was the male hunter, the armed killer, who gained control over humans and other animals alike. Today, we still tend to act ruthlessly as a species towards anything that gets in our way, though the motive is often profit rather than survival.
Japanese fishermen slaughter large numbers of dolphins every year because the dolphins are competing for the same stocks of fish. Fish which represent essential food for the dolphins, but money for the fishermen. Elephants and rhinoceroses are in danger of becoming extinct through the actions of poachers, who kill them to make money from elephant ivory or rhinoceros horns and hides. Whales also face extinction through the greed of those who overcatch and overkill them. Even where we have no direct interest in a species, we can sometimes threaten its survival, as with the American golden eagle, by altering its natural environment through forestry, mining, tourism, or similar economic activities.
And God said, "Let us make man in our image, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And the fear of man and the dread of him shall be upon every beast of the earth. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for him, even as the green herb have I given him all things."
Attitudes towards other animals in Western society have been profoundly influenced by the basic writings of our Jewish and Christian religious heritage. Other religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, tend to have a very different view, in which humans and non-human animals are seen as very similar beings. In the West, we have also been influenced by the ideas of the ancient Greeks. Thinkers such as Aristotle saw nature as an ordered system in which beings with less reasoning ability existed to serve those with more.
Plants exist for the sake of animals, and brute beasts for the sake of man. Since nature makes nothing in vain, it is undeniably true that she has made all animals for the sake of man.
This approach still existed in the 18th century. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that animals could not have the same rights as humans because they were less intelligent.
So far as animals are concerned, we have no direct duties. Animals are not self-conscious and are there merely as means to an end. That end is man.
But the 18th century English thinker, Jeremy Bentham, looked forward to the day when animals would be released from human tyranny.
The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?
This is the key question. If animals can suffer physical and emotional pain, is their right to escape such suffering any less than our own? Do we have the right to inflict suffering on animals to serve our preferences and desires? In part 2, we will examine our use of animals for companionship and entertainment, and above all, as subjects in scientific experiments. What do you think of this statement?
If mankind had to wipe the whole race of tigers from the earth to save just one person I loved, well, there's no question in my mind, the tigers would have to go.
I used to sparkle in the jungle, now I tremble in your cage. You think I'm singing just to please you, but I'm rousing heaven's rage. Why did you hurt me? Why did it have to
part one of this programme, we looked at ways in which human beings use other animals for food and for clothing, and we posed this question.
Do we have the right to inflict suffering and death on other animals to satisfy our human preferences and desires?
In this film strip, we will look briefly at the ways in which humans use animals for entertainment, companionship and sport. But we will concentrate on the very different and widespread use of animals as subjects for scientific experiments, a use which kills millions of animals every week all around the world.
I used to lick the hands that feed me. I hated none and I trusted all. But now I feel those knives inside me, and no one hears my wordless call. Why did you hurt me? Why did it have to be? Have you never had the feeling that it's you that dies and not me?
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, you're crying all the time. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine.
The love and companionship that flows between some pet owners and their pets is one of the gentler features of our civilization. But some see the dictionary definition of slavery as a better description of the relationship.
A slave is one who is another's property, the helpless victim of some dominating influence.
Because the breeding of pet animals is a big and profitable business, far too many pets are bred, particularly dogs and cats. As a result, almost 200,000 unwanted dogs and cats are destroyed every year in Britain by the RSPCA alone. How many other city pets live miserable lives in cramped conditions, with owners who don't understand their basic needs for space and exercise and contact with other members of their own species? Another problem is the number of kangaroos, whales and other wild animals slaughtered to provide pet food for creatures we have bred to the point where they cannot survive on their own. How would you assess the good and bad points of keeping animals as pets, especially those of you that own them?
Crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit. You ain't no friend of mine.
From the earliest days of human settlement, animals have been used not just for food or work or transport, but also to provide entertainment for people. In the arenas of ancient Rome, huge crowds watched wild animals fight men and each other to the death. Often thousands were destroyed in a single day. It wasn't so long ago that legislation to prevent organized cockfights, dogfights and bull baiting was introduced in our society, while the bullfight is still a major event in some countries today. Some other ways in which animals are used for entertainment are shown in this sequence of pictures. Try to imagine in detail what kinds of lives are led by the animals involved in each of these activities.
Then there are the kinds of entertainment that invariably end with an animal's death.
And if it flies, I'll shoot it. If it runs on the ground, if it lives in a cave and it makes a weird sound, I kill all the bears and the lions and the moose with my telescopic sight. You know I'm feeling real loose. I kill all the ducks and the geese and the quail just for a weekend of fun out on a wilderness trail.
How would you assess the use of animals for human entertainment? Do you think some uses are worse than others?
Most people would recoil in horror at the thought of testing dangerous drugs, chemicals, diseases, or research procedures on human beings. After all, we regard human life as sacred. And so, in hundreds of laboratories, millions of animals suffer and die in a wide range of tests and experiments. During 1982, in Britain alone, over 4 million experiments were conducted on live animals, around 80% without anaesthetic. About half of all experiments, many extremely painful, are carried out by commercial companies to develop and test pesticides, drugs, cosmetics, household and industrial products, and many others.
New drugs and medicines are constantly being invented and promoted by drug companies and tested for effectiveness and harmful side effects on animals. Here is the experimenter's description of one such test, performed at the Institute of Psychiatry in London.
Baboons were injected with a drug and then divided into 3 groups. Effects of the drug ranged from biting their limbs, lying on the cage floor for hours, twisting their bodies and screaming.
Cancer research has become big business. In America, more people make a living from cancer than die from it. In Britain, cancer researchers use over 200,000 animals a year. Cancer tumours are grafted or chemically induced into healthy animals, and the results studied while the animals die, sometimes in agony. At the Porton Down Microbiological Research Unit in Wiltshire, animals are injected with dangerous disease viruses in the course of research into biological warfare.
After 3 days, large amounts of mucus fluid poured from their eyes and noses. They had high fevers, lost their appetites, and had difficulty breathing. They were left in this state until death occurred on the 5th, 6th, and 7th day.
This dog has been force-fed with alcohol so that liver damage and other effects of human drinking can be studied. Animal tests are also carried out on the effects of smoking, despite the fact that many governments rely on tax funds from cigarettes and do little to prevent the health problems smoking causes. Vast numbers of psychological tests are also carried out on animals. In many of them, animals are literally driven crazy, often through repeated use of electric shocks. A favourite psychological test is to separate mothers and babies to study the unhappiness, depression and abnormal behaviour that inevitably, and unsurprisingly, follow. Many animal experiments are repeated again and again in universities and institutes around the world, sometimes with minor variations which add little or nothing to the scientific knowledge gained.
This picture shows some of the hundreds of everyday products tested on animals to determine the possible harmful effects of ingredients. One standard test for many of these products, called the Draize test, involves dripping chemicals into the unprotected eyes of conscious rabbits, often with this kind of result. The chemicals remain in the eye for up to 7 days, and no pain relief is given. The only salvation for the rabbits is death.
Another standard test, used for drugs and household products alike, is the LD50 test. LD stands for lethal dose, and the object is to determine what dose of the substance being tested will kill 50% of the test animals. Nearly 500,000 LD50 and similar toxicity tests were carried out in Britain in 1981, many required by law. In many toxicity tests, pedigree dogs are poisoned with substances such as weed killers.
There was marked loss of appetite and body weight, with lassitude, vomiting, and blood-streaked feces. Death occurred on day 4.
Animals are also used in many kinds of experimental situations outside the laboratory. In some countries, as victims in car crash tests. Animals, such as this monkey, are given doses of nuclear radiation as part of war and weapons research. or, like this mouse, are fired into space, usually in somewhat bigger rockets. And of course, animals and fish are killed for use in school biology lessons, though realistic plastic models would often do just as well. The scientific attitude behind all these uses is that animals are merely research tools, not living beings capable of suffering, just like ourselves. Ironically, some of the animals used are in fact people's pets, stolen from their owners and sold cheaply to laboratories.
Is there any justification for the suffering and slaughter endured by animals in laboratories? It may seem difficult to accept the suffering inflicted on animals simply to test products such as cosmetics. But what about medical research? Remember the question raised at the end of part 1.
If mankind had to wipe the whole race of tigers from the earth to save just one person I loved, well, the tigers would have to go.
Would you feel the same? Many people argue that animal experiments have been and will be essential for the continuing progress of medical science. The only alternative, they suggest, would be to use human beings as test subjects instead. The case for animal testing is argued by Dr. James Mitchell, Professor of Pharmacology at the University of Bristol.
In the world at large, there's still an enormous amount of disease, deformity, malnutrition and suffering, not just amongst people, but also amongst animals. This is what we're concerned about, the very large amount of suffering amongst all these living beings throughout the world. And that is why we feel that there's a very strong case for animal experiments in pursuit of medical knowledge to continue. We know already that animal experiments have allowed the prevention of polio, that is now a disease of the past, and so is smallpox, and many other illnesses have been prevented and eliminated by animal experiments. Anybody who tells you that animals involved in experiments in laboratories invariably experience suffering and pain are simply telling you lies. There is occasional slight discomfort amongst laboratory animals. For instance, they may be given an anesthetic through an injection with a hypodermic needle, and this involves a prick through their skin. That's the degree of suffering in the majority of medical type experiments. There are other types of experiments which involve testing new cosmetics, for instance, or new foodstuffs in animals. My own feeling is that if we are to have new cosmetics or new foods, and society seems to go on wanting these things, then they must be tested, and they can only be tested in animals before they can go on the open market. Well, I hope you'll feel that the case for experiments on animals is very strong indeed, and that without them you would not be living the healthy life you lead at the moment. We would be surrounded by disease. We would die very much younger than we do at the moment. We'd be back in the Middle Ages from the point of view of medicine.
Opponents of testing argue that to inflict suffering on animals, whatever the benefit to human beings, is morally wrong. But they also claim that many of the experiments conducted are scientifically misleading and based on a misguided view of what medicine should be about. Their case is argued by Dr. Robert Sharp, Scientific Research Officer of the National Anti-Vivisection Society.
Animal experiments have a basic weakness. The results cannot be applied to human beings with any degree of confidence. For instance, penicillin is highly poisonous to guinea pigs, and luckily for us was not tested on this species during its development, or we might not have this useful drug today. The LD50 test is a ritual mass slaughter, where results can even vary widely from lab to lab for the same chemical in the same species. Not only that, but many LD50s seem particularly pointless because such huge doses are needed to kill the animals. The next time you put sugar in your tea or coffee, think about the fact that rats are killed by being force-fed the human equivalent of 5.5 pounds of sugar at one go. Alternative tests using bacteria, yeast, cells and plants are available. but they are at an early stage of development and should be made a specific area of urgent priority. We should also question our overwhelming reliance on drugs, which so often treat the symptoms of disease rather than the underlying causes. Drugs make a lot of money for their producers, but aren't always best for the sick person. More emphasis should be put on disease prevention. For instance, most cancers are preventable, being linked with smoking, diet and the environment. Yet almost all funds are spent on investigating cancer after it has started. Some people say animal tests are scientifically justified because the animals are like us. But then they say the experiments are morally justified because the animals are not like us. They can't have it both ways.
How do you feel about the use of animals for scientific testing and experimentation?
Britain is usually seen as a nation of animal lovers, and most people assume that there are laws preventing cruelty and abuse. In 1876, Parliament passed the Cruelty to Animals Act, still in force today. In 1878, 23 people were licensed under the Act to perform experiments on living animals, and 270 experiments were performed. In 1979, 20,700 people were licensed, and almost 5 million experiments performed. Because of this vast increase, many people feel that the Act is now out of date. Although ordinary citizens can be fined or even sent to prison for treating a pet animal in this fashion, laboratory animals can be legally subjected to even worse suffering. Under provisions recently added to the 1876 Act, any animal suffering pain that is severe or likely to endure must be painlessly killed, as long as the main result of the experiment has been attained. Because the extent of pain and the achievements of the experiment are determined by the experimenter, however, the Act in practice sanctions unrelieved animal suffering. Checking these conditions for the millions of experiments performed each year is the job of just 15 Home Office inspectors. There has never been a conviction for cruelty to a laboratory animal under the Act.
The main aim of this programme has been to encourage you to think more carefully about the very different ways that humans treat other animals, and about the relationship between human and animal rights and needs. We have tried to suggest that there are different points of view on all the issues involved, even though this programme is clearly biased in favour of greater animal rights. You may be wondering how you can get more information, or even what you can do to help reduce animal suffering. Here are some ideas.
There is a growing amount of literature on animal rights issues. A number of relevant books and other publications are listed in the teacher's notes that accompany this programme. The addresses of organisations that campaign on both sides of the issue are also listed. You may be particularly interested in a group called Youth for Animal Rights. On an individual level, there are actions you can take against animal suffering. How do you feel about eating meat? What about fish, or eggs, or milk? A number of companies produce cosmetics without animal testing procedures. Would you prefer to buy these products? The current Education Act allows you to refuse to take part in dissection lessons if they're carried on at your school. Would you be prepared to discuss this issue with your biology teacher, explaining your point of view?
There are large and powerful economic interests behind the continuation of the most cruel and widespread denials of animal rights. The medical and drug establishment is one, and the agribusiness establishment is another. Animals cannot protest against these practices with votes or petitions or marches. If greater animal rights are to be achieved, human beings will have to do it for them. Do you think it is right that we should do so?